Thank you all for coming, and in particular want to thank you for finding your way over from our usual location in the Student Forum. So today's quarters are a little bit closer, and we will not have a sound system today, so I'll ask all the panelists to speak a little bit louder than usual, and then when we open it up to questions from all of you, we'd ask that you do your best to make sure you're heard by the whole group as well. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Dan Schnur, and I'm the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics, and we co-sponsor these lunches every Wednesday as part of the Road to the White House series, along with the Center for Communications Leadership at the Annenberg School and the Bedrosian Institute for Public Policy at the Price School. We take turns co-hosting these lunches, and on the weeks that Unruh hosts, we co-host these discussions with the College Democrats, the College Republicans, and the Daily Trojan. And I'm joined, as I am for all of our panels, with one of the Daily Trojan's editors, and sitting immediately to my left here is Rachel Bracker, who is the DT's news editor, and she'll be joining me and asking the questions of our panel today. As I think you all know, today's discussion ought to be a really interesting one. From the Tea Party to Occupy, how populist movements shape American politics. And we've got, I think, is a terrific panel here today to lead us through the discussion. And I'll just take a minute to introduce each of them. Sitting way down at the other end of the table, at a safe distance.
On your right.
Exactly, as usual, is my friend Jon Fleischman. And Jon is the founder and the publisher of the Flash Report, which is the most influential conservative website in the state of California and one of the most influential in the country. He's also the president of Fleischman Consulting Group and one of the state's most respected political analysts. Jon, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me. That's right.
Skipping ahead just a moment, at least geographically, to the gentleman here in the jacket who just waved, is another friend, Larry Eason. And Larry is the founder and president of .orgpower.com. And as the title of his company suggests, Larry is one of the state's most significant experts when it comes to online campaigning, and in particular to online issue advocacy. He's the winner of the Institute of Politics, Democracy, and Internet's Golden Dot Award for Best Statewide Internet Campaign. He's a columnist for the Huffington Post. And like Jon, one of the state's most respected political analysts. Larry, thank you for coming. Flanking Larry on either side is Alex Yebri, who's the vice president of the USC College Republicans. Fritz Paustick, who represents the USC College Democrats. Alex and Fritz, thank you. All right, let's get started. Rachel, kick it off.
All right. So one of our first questions is for Fritz. There's a lot of sort of similarities and differences between the Tea Party and the Occupy movement. Could you walk us through those a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the differences. Obviously, while the Occupy movement and the Tea Party, I think that represent different ideological factions, we can sort of decidedly say that one is more leftist and one is more conservative, and I think that that's a pretty uncontroversial thing to say. But I think that there is actually some degree of overlap between the two movements, and namely, while both have their distinct political ideologies, I think both of them have large contingencies of independent voters that are not necessarily affiliated with the Democratic Party, not necessarily affiliated with the Republican Party, but independent voters who probably will play a huge role in the 2012 election, who are discontent with our current political system. There are people in both groups that are really angry about the status quo and probably have a good reason to be, and really the only meaningful difference between them is they're angry at two different groups of people. I would say that generally speaking, the Tea Party movement is more angry at the government, and the Occupy movement is more angry at the private sector and the influence it has over the government. I think that both groups have the ability to be very, very influential in this election, and that's another similarity that they have. And I think it'll be really, really interesting to see how that plays out. I think that one thing that's important to discuss between the two is that they both have ideologies that they adhere to. I think that a difference between them is that the Tea Party movement has probably done a better job at making their ideology more tangible, at making it more known and actually affecting some degree of policy change with that. I think one of the criticisms of the Occupy Wall Street movement is that they don't have a clear ideology and they're not good at organizing around a clear message. I don't think that's true at all. I think the Occupy movement has a clear set of policy principles or policy ideas they want to see enacted. Maybe they haven't done a great job at actually getting together around that idea, but I think that it's not accurate to say that they don't have a clear message of what they want to happen in this country. I think that they support things like financial reform and increasing taxes for the wealthy, and those are very tangible, concrete policy proposals that would be sort of universally supported among that movement. They just maybe haven't done a great job at actually spreading that message.
Fritz, let's definitely come back to the policy agendas and the messaging of the two movements in a minute or two, but I want to go to Larry with a question, because Larry, even though the two movements have very significant differences, what you have, though, in either party is a real benefit from the kind of energy and enthusiasm that a movement like this brings. On the other hand, it creates some challenges, too. And maybe you can talk about how the two parties are dealing with both the opportunities and the challenges that the Tea Party and the occupiers present to them.
Sure. I mean, I think on both sides, the opportunity, especially coming up at the general election, is the ability to harness all that energy and focus it. And my specialty, just so that you know, is in using technology to move your goals forward. And technology will play a significant role in the upcoming election. I think up until this point, it's played a role, for example, on the Occupy side in helping to fuel the movement as people are able to share content and ideas, mobilize quickly. And on the Tea Party side, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But as we shift towards the general election, things are going to shift towards more of a get out the vote, identify your voters and get out the vote strategy. And technology, now with VAN, which we can go into, but the VAN system, and on the Republican side, our votes. I mean, you can really mobilize a massive volunteer base, kind of crowdsource that outreach to your targeted voters, and mobilize your volunteers to do very, very specific, impactful work. And so, if the Tea Party is successful on one side, or the Occupy folks are successful on the other side at mobilizing those very passionate supporters to use those technologies to go out and do the work in a disciplined fashion to get out to voters, that's going to be really helpful. From my perspective, there's a big if there, I think. But on the danger side, I can just relate from my own, experience. I'm a fairly moderate. Maybe I lean a little bit left on some things, but I work in the humanitarian sector and environmental sector, and I work a lot with on education reform, and so I kind of right in the middle on some of these things. And I can just tell you, there's a huge part of the country that's looking at both sides and kind of going, can I relate to this? Not just what folks are advocating for, but how they're doing it and what it seems like. Are these, when I see the images on TV of the Occupy movement, do I think to myself, that's kind of like me? That may not be a fair question, but that's a question that people ask themselves. And the same thing, on the Tea Party side. And I think that represents a real challenge, and I think more, frankly, on the left than it does on the right. So I think people might look at the Tea Party, like the center of the Republicans, the more moderate Republicans, look at the Tea Party and say, well, we may disagree on issues, but I can relate to those people. They seem like me. But the folks who I work with on a day-to-day basis, who might be more moderate, but care about the environment, care about women's health, et cetera, and are looking at the images and hearing some of the things coming across on over the internet, TV from the Occupy side, I think they might agree on some of the issues and really be able to relate to why folks are out there protesting, but might look at those images and feel like I have a hard time relating to this movement. Again, I'm not saying that's fair, but I can tell you from the folks who I spent a lot of time talking to today, that's an issue.
Well, I think I'm going to switch gears a little. I have a question for Alex. How do you think that, we've been talking a little about the different sort of groups that will be that will look at the Occupy Tea Party movement. How do you think that those will affect the Republican primary specifically?
I think what we're seeing right now in the Republican Party is a splitter, a three-way fraction between, I think, the social conservatives.
Alex, just because we don't have a mic.
Yeah, the social conservatives, the fiscal conservatives, who I do think represent the Tea Party, and also the more moderate establishment Republicans that are going with Mitt Romney. I think the Tea Party has kind of transformed into the base of the Republican Party. They are, I think, anti-establishment. They've moved more to the right, and we're seeing a large, consistent group of people coming out, voting against the establishment, and saying that we want a more conservative alternative. Because of the years of the Bush years, they believe that, I think, the higher debt, the more deficits that we have seen, that they are, I think, just frustrated with the current system in Washington. So I do think for the election coming up, the Tea Party will play a huge role. We've seen them, out in debates and endorsing candidates and coming out, and every candidate has wanted the voice of the Tea Party. So overall, I think they're going to play a huge role. In 2010, we saw them really out there being prominent, electing officials, taking stances on the issues, and really, making a huge impact on the on just what was going on in Congress with the debt, everything that was going on with the debt limit, and with their downgrade and everything. They were standing up for what they believed in, when a lot of the representatives in Congress were just kicking the can down the road and continuing to spend and continuing to tax and do what I think, what a lot of Americans see as just the continuation of the kind of establishment representation. So I do think it will play a huge role in the upcoming election. I think once we get to the general election, both sides will kind of come closer, come back to the middle, and they'll try their best to motivate their base, which I think is the Tea Party and is the fiscal conservatives, while also being able to, come after the moderate independent voters who really make up the winning fraction. If you get those independent voters, you will win the election. So that's what I think.
Hey, John, I want to ask you in a minute or two to talk about the technology, given what you've been able to
You're
accomplish.
going to take a minute or two to frame your whole question?
I think I will. That's great. In the meantime, though, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Tea Party, building off of Alex's point, both in terms of what it's been able to accomplish, for example, in the 2010 elections, but also some of the frustrations Tea Partiers are feeling in the current presidential campaign. So maybe you can pick up where Alex left off and talk a little bit about the Tea Party's impact in both the last election and in the current one.
Sure. Well, the Tea Party movement is it's a grassroots movement that, when we saw it kind of rise up really in this last election cycle, it was, I was at the state capitol and watched 40,000 people in front of the state capitol come from all kinds of places. Those are real numbers when you have that many people come together. And I think the key has been able to focus them, and that's where you kind of have an interesting, we talk about the impacts of, you were just in the green room, you were talking to us about the rise of cable news television. I think when you take a broad movement such as the Tea Party movement, and then you kind of join it at the hip with like Fox News, where everybody it used to be in the old days that kind of a movement that was all around it's like people had to try to talk to people, and what are you doing in your town, and what are you doing in my town? And now, and frankly, the same thing would probably be the case with the Occupy movement. Everything that happened is nationalized, and so everybody gets to see what everybody's doing, and the Tea Party movement really, I think, synthesized into an activist agenda. One thing that I've noticed about the Tea Party movement, which is different, I've been doing the GOP thing for about a quarter of a century. That makes you feel old, Dan. And I have never seen a movement like this, which is a kind of an economic conservative movement, which my colleague touched on. Case in point, yesterday I emailed around to a few of the Tea Party leaders in California saying, hey, do you guys have any reaction to what happened with Prop 8? And every Tea Party group basically said, well, I have my own, every Tea Party leader basically said, I've got my own opinion about Prop 8, but our movement's about the size and scope of government, so we're not really weighing in on that. And so the Tea Party movement truly is an economic size of government, liberty kind of a movement. And so it's kind of ironic because while I believe that the Tea Party in itself is kind of represents kind of extremism in the form of activism, what they do represent, and I think this was mentioned earlier, is somebody kind of watching on TV who says, you know what, these guys are all talking about the issues that I care about, which is taxes and spending too much. And sure, there are, you're going to, if you watch 40,000 people in front of the Capitol, one of them's going to be dressed up like Benjamin Franklin, and somebody else is going to be walking around with a sign that says abortion stops a beating heart. But overall, the Tea Party movement, what it's done on the Republican side, is kind of center the party on economic issues going into now what is an election about the economy. But to get to the other half of your point, the challenge that we run into is that I hear from lots of people in the Tea Party movement that they are really not that satisfied with the candidates that have kind of made it through the Republican Party process to date. I'm an active Facebook person. You can find me on there. And the other day, after Mitt Romney won Nevada, I kind of put on my post, I go, well, I guess I'll go have some vanilla pudding in honor of Romney's victory, because I'm a pretty conservative guy, and Romney doesn't really inspire me that much. And I had over 255 comments from people from all over the country kind of echoing, hey, we agree. And it's a challenge that we're going to have. And the interesting part, again, we were discussing this in the green room, is the dynamic that's going to take place going into the election. And you've got a kind of a push and a pull where, usually, going all the way back to, was it Nixon that actually said, it was his phrase that said, you run to the right in the primary, or the left if you're the Democrat, and then you run to the center in the general election. And we're now finding ourselves, especially because of these two movements, with a unique scenario where the nominees of both parties are going to have to be a bit more nuanced, because in a rush to the center, they could very much alienate what is now a very worked up, motivated base on the right and left, which is going to be needed for getting out the vote. And I'll finish by saying, and it goes back to the point that the esteemed Mr. Easton made, which is about targeted getting out the vote. And one statistic that I like to throw out there that I learned from my internet colleague Leslie Miller from the Obama campaign was that more phone calls and activities for getting out the vote in Ohio were generated from California than took place in Ohio. And the point being that you're now in a position to be focused to contact your friends or to make phone calls or to do activities here to impact a battleground state. And so while you may be thinking, oh, in this state, well, there really aren't that many Occupy people or there aren't that many Tea Party people, it's not a big deal. The question is, as a candidate, are you motivating this base of activists all around the country who have the ability, because of technology, to now make a difference where you need them to in those swing 8 or 9 battleground states? I know I was all over the map, but there you go.
Just what we were looking for.
Of course.
Hey, let me come to you for a second. I think John and Alex did a very good job of talking about the Tea Party vis-a-vis the Republican primary. Obviously, there's not a Democratic presidential primary, but President Obama in his re-election campaign faced a similar sort of challenge. In other words, how do you create a motivation for a populist movement like the Occupiers without compromising your ability to reach out to other voters?
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point it's difficult and you can't get all the voters, right? There's no way that Obama is going to be able to get all of the independent voters he wants and all of the Occupy Wall Street leftist voters that he wants. That's just not possible, right? I think that what he's attempted to do so far, and this doesn't just apply to Obama, I think this applies more generally to a lot of prominent Democratic politicians, particularly ones that are running for office in this particular election cycle, is without explicitly aligning themselves with the Occupy movement, they have sort of adopted a lot of the ideologies and even some of the policy proposals of the Occupy movement. And just as an aside note, I think that's a key distinction between the Occupy movement and the Tea Party. The Tea Party sort of organizes together and actually directly and explicitly endorses candidates and gets behind candidates. The Occupy movement voices these opinions, and I think that Democratic politicians see an opportunity to take some votes from those supporters based off of their opinions. So, I mean, I think we've seen Obama sort of co-opt some of the policy proposals, some of the ideologies of the Occupy movement, and sort of couching it in slightly different jargon. So, for example, instead of maligning the 1% explicitly, which would be, the direct rhetoric of the Occupy movement, I think that Obama and some of the prominent Democratic politicians have talked about, making the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share, which is just a semantically different way to describe functionally the same thing. And I think that Democratic politicians are campaigning on a lot of these same ideas and same policy proposals without explicitly aligning themselves with the Occupy movement. So not just Obama, who paid some lip service to some of the things, like he talked about banning insider trading among United States congressmen and women in his State of the Union address, paying some lip service, throwing some bones to the Occupy movement. Other politicians have been doing this as well. If you look at, for example, Elizabeth Warren's Senate campaign in Massachusetts, she's campaigning a lot of the same ideas that the Occupy movement has coalesced around without directly and explicitly aligning herself with that movement. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not that's actually a successful strategy, because I think that there will be some. Obviously, the Occupy movement is not going to, as a unit, vote for the Republican candidate. That's not going to happen. I think it'll be interesting to see if they can bring in some of those more leftist voters without sacrificing a lot of the independents. I would say that the strategy that they've adopted so far is probably one of the better strategies that you could adopt. There's probably no perfect mechanism through which to get all of the leftist voters you want and all the centrist voters that you want. But I think that sort of throwing some bones to them and talking about a lot of the same issues as them without explicitly aligning yourself with them is a good way to bring in some of those voters without losing a lot of the centrist voters that helped elect Obama in the 2008 election. Thank you, Fritz.
And to ask John to sort of build on that, how do you think that the Democratic Party could sort of use technology to maybe mobilize the Occupy voters, and what kind of role did technology play in getting them together? Because it obviously was a big part of their movement.
And maybe that's better suited for Larry. And
Well, she was actually looking at Larry and said, John,
Oh,
I have an
sorry.
effect on all women.
Save one.
Save one, right. Exactly.
I mean, if I can circle back to that, but just touching on something that John mentioned, which I think is going to play a real prominent role in this election, which is that the presidential is going to be won in a handful of states, but it's not going to be. You can't do a local election anymore, right? Because
Every speech
you
you
can't
national, everything.
exactly. So we can't say one thing here and then say something else the next day over here because everybody already knows that's
Right, it used to be
going
you
on.
could go to Iowa and talk about how great corn subsidies were, and then fly out to California and talk about the horrible farm bill.
Right.
And now everyone's watching the same speech.
So that's a huge challenge. And then, related only by the fact that it's driven by technology is the other thing that you mentioned, which is that people are going to be campaigning in these swing states from all over the country. And the main thing that I think about is I try to look at through the eyes of a voter, and I go, wow, I'm glad I'm not in a swing state, and I really pity those swing voters in those states because imagine the number of phone calls and Facebook posts, and, it's going to be, which I think gets to something that's going to happen. It happened last election, and it's going to be even more of a major push this year. In part because both sides now have this technology. Whether it happens this year or not, in the future, I think what we're going to see is more and more. Really, the person you want to hear from is somebody you trust. So it's not the random person who's calling you up you've never met and they're from California, right? You want to hear from somebody you trust if they're trying to get you out to vote. And you started to see that in the shame stuff that happened on Facebook. Like, you're registered to vote, you haven't voted in the last couple elections, what's up? People were doing that to their friends. Now, that was kind of uncomfortable and a bummer to be on the receiving end of that, but we'll see more of that. But I think over time, what we're going to see is the mashing up of data that tells you, this is a sometimes voter that is key in a key district, and you're connected to them, and here's how you can reach out to them, and here's the script to use to have one of those really trusting conversations. I mean, it sounds funny to say that, but you can actually do that now en masse in a very, very targeted way. And I think that's what we're going to start to see.
And especially with social networking, like, for example, how many people in this room are on Facebook? Just about everybody, right? And how many people here get on Facebook and start populating Facebook with their favorite music, their favorite TV shows, their favorite hobbies, their favorite politicians? All that's data that, believe it or not, can be mined and can be begotten, so that all of a sudden when he starts the targeting that he's talking about comes when all of a sudden they're able to say, hey, you may be in California, but did you know, for example, that there are USC alumni that are in Indiana? And would you be willing to make phone calls and just make a pitch? Hey, I'm a student at USC, and we know you're living in Indiana now, but we wanted to give you a shout out. Fight on and vote for, depending on which one of these guys call. And that's going to happen.
The danger, though, just really quickly, is that that's not why people are on Facebook.
Right.
They're on Facebook to play games and share photos. I mean, doing more of it. If you look at the page views on Facebook.
Be nice, okay?
No, but I'm just saying that's what people are doing on Facebook, and so predominantly. And so,
We're suddenly on Facebook, Dan?
No, just
Mr. Off the Grid?
no. It plays a role for causes, whether it's election or NGO, nonprofit, or whatever. But you have to understand why people are there and what they're doing in order to tap into that successfully. So, again, it's going to be really interesting to see how the campaigns leverage technology to reach out to targeted voters, but try to do that in ways where they're actually reaching them through a trusted friend.
John, let me ask you this by way of following up. You talked a little bit earlier about the impact of technology on these movements and their ability to flourish. Talk a little bit about online media. As I mentioned when I introduced you, you started a very prominent and very influential website where California conservatives can rally and organize, and corresponding websites exist on the left as well.
Sure.
Talk about how the spread and growing influence of online media allows a movement like one of these to grow.
Sure. This is where you do the classic deal where he asks you one question and you answer a different one first. I did want to make a point that I had in the back of my mind, which one of the things that's going to be interesting in the fall is watching, in these battleground states, there'll be 8 or 10 of them. Somebody made the point up here that it's really going to be a small group of the almost centrist voters that ultimately are decision makers. And it'll be very interesting to watch, presumably Obama and presumably Mitt Romney kind of trade off of these movements. I think the best thing that's ever happened for Barack Obama's re-election is the Occupy movement, because watch him on one hand kind of placate it, but in the general election watch him thrive on saying, I'm not an extreme liberal, they are.
Right.
And he will actually use the Occupy movement to posture himself as the more reasonable, moderate Democrat, because the votes, there's nobody rational in the Occupy movement, well, I should say as a sentence, period, but there's nobody rational in the Occupy movement who's not going to, when the choice comes between Barack Obama and the Republican, is not going to vote for Barack Obama. He doesn't need their votes. He wants their activism, and he wants to use them to center himself. And similarly, with Romney, he will use it kind of to center himself as well, and it'll be interesting. On the issue of technology, which you brought up, it's kind of, I mentioned the cable news and the ability of people to kind of watch and see what things are doing, but technology and the use of the web and use of social networking, which is becoming, I think, quickly eclipsing website. I have found with my website, for example, that I have more influence on the Facebook version of my website than I do on the actual website itself. I mean, everything we do, links and all of that, but it's the interactive tool, the ability to share information. It's really an ability to network and grow and interact with the people and with other people and tell them what you're doing, and it creates this kind of energy to be able to be impactful and again communicate with people about what you're doing, and that's how things go viral, and that's how movements grow, and that's how impact is felt. And so the easier it is for that to happen, the more that it happens and the more impactful it is. I think the biggest challenge that you face is kind of keeping it alive and keeping it contemporary, because people get motivated for bursts of time and then they move on to something else. And so the real question is going to be, does the Occupy movement, does the Tea Party movement crystallize at the time of the year this year that it will need to in order to be effective?
And to ask Alice another question, if the Tea Party movement does crystallize a little more, do you think that they can get behind Romney, who's seen as this vanilla pudding candidate?
Well, I think the Republican nomination is a venue where the Tea Party can look for alternatives. We've seen them, go from candidate to candidate. Herman Cain, Rick Perry, Michelle Bachmann. They've been really looking for that alternative to Mitt Romney. I think if Romney does get the nomination, that they have so much passionate dislike for the policies of Barack Obama that they will come together and form a coalition and back Mitt Romney. Again, Romney has moved to the right on a lot of issues, to actually appeal to the Tea Party, especially in places like Florida, which is going to be a huge state in the upcoming election. And I think just in general, we have to realize that the Tea Party is, at the end of the day, going to come after, I think, the left and the Occupy Wall Street movement, the same way I think the Occupy Wall Street movement will do the same with Mitt Romney. So what we're going to see, I think, is when they come back to the middle, to the center, Romney has to find a set of issues that he can go back to the Tea Party on. It's, I think, more fiscal matters, more on the business side, more on the pro-capitalist side, and to make sure that he doesn't anger that side of the vote, which he's going to need, that 40% of the conservative vote that he needs to carry this election. He's going to need it. And also, just on the media aspect of it, I think we need to point out that the super PACs, the new decision with the Citizens United, opens up a huge venue for, I think, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement to, back a candidate without actually, I think, annoying the moderate voters who don't want to see the Tea Party out there every single day, campaigning. If they have a venue that they can just, blitz people with their ads attacking Barack Obama, or the other way around with the Occupy Wall Street movement, will be very beneficial for both sides. So we will see, we'll see probably one of the dirtiest campaigns ever because of this decision. And
I'm going to weigh in at the end before it shifts over to the left side there to just kind of say that I have a saying that I close every speech by saying that compared to Barack Obama, Mitt Romney looks like Attila the Hun. And so don't underestimate, when you get into a general election, people are going to get in their corners. And, there's two ways to motivate somebody. You can be motivated because of what you're for, and you can be motivated because of what you're against. And Barack Obama has not governed from the center. Obamacare and all these issues are going to resonate very strongly with the base. And we'll be doing a lot of get out the vote that maybe Romney himself couldn't do, because he may not motivate a Tea Partier as much as the prospect of getting rid of Obama will motivate the Tea Party.
Well,
There you go.
As we shift from Rachel and me asking questions to opening it up to all of you guys, what I gather, not just from John's last comment, but collectively from what you guys have had to say, is that the occupiers and the Tea Party movement have the potential to play a significant role in this election. But what primarily brings them to the table, ironically enough, and really motivates them to get involved, is less the candidate on their side of the aisle than fear or anger toward the possible alternative. Interesting. We're going to open it up to all of you guys now, and as we do every week, a reminder, two reminders actually. Number one, we ask that when you have a chance to talk, that you tell us who you are before you ask your question. And number two, just as a reminder, particularly if you're going to ask a question of someone with whom you may happen to disagree, we ask that you address that person with the same respect and the same regard that you want them to show for you if they were asking you a question. So with that, let's open it up.
Hi, I'm Shashaman. I'm an undergrad sociology major. I had a question for Jon. Actually, earlier you talked a little bit about Prop 8 and the Tea Party response to that. And I could be totally wrong, so totally correct me. My understanding of the decision had more to do with the ability of a voter to vote on an initiative that impinges on the rights of a population. So wouldn't that actually be within the scope of the Tea Party rhetoric, and why would they avoid responding to that if that's the case?
One of the things I have found with a lot of these Tea Party movement leaders is a very high, they have kind of come around through the real process of grassroots activism to a degree of political sophistication that sometimes impresses even me. One of the people well, I mean, in theory, the whole idea is these are kind of grassroots people. I consider myself kind of a political pro. And these folks are theoretically, one week I was in my kitchen or I was in my garage, and now I'm organizing 4,000 people in my community, right? And so when I talked to one of these people and I said that very thing, isn't this a decision saying that the people by initiative can't make a decision? And their response was, like, that's going to come through? Anything that I say, this whole issue is framed on the issue of gay marriage. And so I think that for us, there's really no way that we're going to be able to weigh in without getting caught up in that issue. It's like, how do you say, well, this was the exact quote, kind of on the esoteric issue of populist and being able to have a majority role. Yeah, we kind of agree, but we're not really weighing in for the underlying policy issue. This was a Sacramento Tea Party movement guy, but I think that's what you ran into is that and another one told me, which I thought was telling, a big this is somebody from out in the Inland Empire, a big chunk of the people in his Tea Party movement are also people that are pro-gay rights. And he didn't want to speak out and alienate. He said, some of these guys are my best activists that come to these events that want to shut down the size and scope of government. And if I speak on that, I whittle away our coalition, so we're really good about staying on message. So it was just kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that the Tea Party has forced a lot of discipline over the course of the last couple of years, both fighting the Obama administration and then also in this campaign, and that's going to, that's going to serve them well. And one of the questions when we were, chatting beforehand that's on my mind is, it's a very different thing to go protest and to hang out with your friends and hold signs, and it's a different feel, different type of movement. It's a lot different to sit on your phones, on your phone, and call people, hour after hour after hour, and you have people screaming at you and hanging up on you, and that takes a lot of discipline. And so, will that translate? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not really qualified, to speak to it. I don't know. I'm wondering about that.
Well, Alex is qualified to speak to it.
Can I just respond to the question? I think that the Occupy Wall Street movement has one issue also that I think at the end of the day is going to kind of is going to create a fraction within that. I think the Keystone Pipeline, where you have, I think, unions in favor of an actual creation of jobs and an actual creation of economic growth, and then the environmental movement, who is really totally against any idea of this natural gas, exporting natural gas to the United States. So I think that within these movements, there's a lot of self-interest playing in. And just like the Tea Party, I think you were totally right about the sophistication of the Tea Party and the fact that they understand that you can't alienate a certain segment of your electorate. At the end of the day, social conservatives and evangelical voters play a huge role, especially in the South. And if any Republican wants to get elected, they need to play into that constituency. So I think that Occupy Wall Street movement has to understand, has to also come out with their own set of objectives and what interests do they want to come into.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you all for being here. I have a question for everybody. It's regarding
And you are?
candidates and the Republican side.
I'm sorry, you are?
Oh, my name is Adas Jabe. I'm a journalist. And my question is, do you know when the personalities or the style of a candidate will cease to be more important than the substance? And can we expect that? Because I remember when Bush got reelected, when I used to live in Texas, people said that I reelected him because I loved to have a beer with him because he seems like a cool guy. And when Obama got elected, people thought he's a great speaker and he was going to be a good president. And now people still think he's a great speaker. I don't know if they still think he's a good president. So my question is, do you know when the personalities will be less important than the actual?
And let me add on to that. It's a great question. Let me add on to that. To what extent do these types of populist movements, the Tea Party and the Occupy movements, to what extent do they mobilize around a particular candidate's persona as opposed to a set of issues? John,
Well, I was just going to actually say, I have a quote from a good friend of mine, Gary South, who is a liberal Democrat, who I don't agree with on much, but he would tell you that the higher up the office is, the less the voter is focused on individual policy issues and more they're focused on the character of the candidate. So personality becomes important because, for example, a president of the United States has to weigh in on so many issues that you can't really assess what they're going to do on every issue. So you have to say, take a measure of the man or the woman and where are they coming from, what are their moral values, what is their decision-making process, what's their temperament, how would they guide things. That having been said, there are some major public policy issues, and I really think that when you get to a race between two people, you'll find that policy is more likely to come to the fore, especially if it's Romney, because it's not like there's a big personality there to pull out. So the reality is I think you're going to see a lot more of a policy-driven debate, but it's just natural. The higher, if you're talking to somebody running for city council, why is my water bill higher? You really care about the local issues. But when you're way up and talking about president, who somebody is what matters the most to a lot of the voters. Chris?
Yeah. I guess the cynical answer to that question that I'm inclined to agree with is never. I don't think that we will ever reach a state in which the average voter is more concerned with the policy issues of a certain candidate than the personality of that certain candidate. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I could take one approach and say the average voter doesn't have enough information to really make a coherent decision about who to vote for apart from the personality of that particular candidate. I don't think it's really necessary to say that. I think that the trend that we've seen probably in the last few decades, and I say we've seen like I was around then because I wasn't, that's been in the last few decades of placing a huge emphasis on the personality of a particular candidate that's running for office, particularly as John talked about, the higher up the office is a function of the influence of media over our political system. In the 1960 election, when there were the debates between Kennedy and Nixon, one of the things that really helped swing the election in favor of Kennedy was the fact that Kennedy did really, really well in the televised debates, and that was the first time the debates were televised. Nixon was sitting there, he was nervous, he was sweaty, and people didn't want to vote for him. He came off as personality-wise a weaker candidate. And I think that with the advent of new forms of media, with Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, or as I call them, you twit face, we see that media has such a strong influence over our political system and the voting process that I think it just exacerbates the emphasis that we place on the personality of the candidates. We focus more on the flash of the candidate, not the actual issues that they stand for, because the average candidate gets so much more media exposure than they did in the past.
I'm going to take moderator's prerogative for a second, because I can, and offer a slightly different opinion than John's and Fritz's. I'm not sure I'd agree with the premise of your question. I wouldn't try to argue that personality doesn't matter. There's no question that a politician, as John said, particularly one running for a higher office in which there is a great deal of media attention, that candidate does need to be able to figure out a way to form an emotional connection with his or her audience. But if you look back at the last two presidential elections, I don't think Barack Obama got elected president because he was a more gifted speaker than John McCain. He got elected president because he opposed a war in Iraq that most Americans didn't oppose, and because he was running for president at a time when the nation was facing an economic catastrophe, and he represented a more pronounced change of direction on economic issues. I don't think George Bush won 4 years before that because he'd be more to beer with than John Kerry, although he doesn't drink, so that gets a little bit complicated. But rather because Americans decided that they felt that given the import they were placing at that time on the war on terror and national security, they felt that he was a more reliable choice. Your question is based on a good premise. Personality does matter, but I think voters are smart enough to weigh personality within the context of the policy matters that impact their lives.
I think that it's entirely possible over time that people will become, I mean, nobody likes how campaigns are waged. You know, none of us like being on the receiving end of those advertisements and those phone calls, and so will the electorate begin to look for alternative ways of getting information and use technology to do that, sharing information with friends that they trust and that they feel simpatico with, and start to make decisions in that way, because the way that we're campaigning now is so degrading and off-putting. I mean, that kind of a movement may emerge over time as a way to actually try to rescue the democracy, because participation rates, begin to erode. So, will that happen? I don't know, but you see pockets of that already.
Other questions? Yes.
David Gassworth, I'm a PhD student at the Price School. So my question is, if the Tea Party is such a significant portion of the Republican Party at this point, why haven't we been able to identify a candidate in this primary that the Tea Party could rally around? They were very successful in congressional elections to find Tea Party candidates. And in one case, the son of one of the presidential candidates was the Tea Party candidate for a Senate election, Rand Paul. So why isn't Ron Paul the Tea Party candidate, or why haven't any of the other people that seem like Tea Party candidates been able to make any significant headway in this election?
I think, to address your question directly, I think that a campaign for President of the United States is it's a big deal, and it's a major endeavor, and it involves a significant ability to raise money, and a significant ability to be organized, and it advantages the process for people that have kind of started the process early. And not to use this analogy again, but if you're running for school board, you can kind of decide, hey, I'm going to file next week when filing opens. but you can't really do that when you're running for. Case in point, Newt Gingrich, has got money and he's credible, and he's not on a half a dozen key state ballots because the process to get on the ballot for a lot of these Republican primaries is so arduous and so complicated. You have to start very early. And so I guess to answer your question, it's very difficult to take a grassroots movement and synthesize it so effectively on a national level that it just kind of produces a national candidate.
But isn't Ron Paul the ultimate Tea Party candidate? I mean, his focus is on economic issues. That's what the Tea Party cares about.
Yeah, but
so why isn't he good enough?
It's Rand Paul or Rand Paul?
Ron.
I don't think Ron. I mean, while I think the Tea Party focuses on economic issues, I mean, Ron Paul's a nut. I mean,
So is it about?
It's about personalities. It's about having policy positions like, we deserve to have the World Trade Center blow up because we were screwing around in their country. The guy doesn't create an opportunity for rational people to think that's our guy. So you get a lot of people who want to make a statement by voting for him, but I find very few people that are rational that actually think he should be president. By the way, I voted for Ron Paul in the primary in 2008 because, with all due deference to my friend Dan Schnurr, I think John McCain is terrible, and I didn't want to send a message that I would support him in a primary. But I would not have voted for. I would have voted Libertarian before I vote. Ironically, before I vote for Ron Paul in a general election.
It's a reasonable guess to ask how many angry emails Jon Fleischman is going to get in the next 24 hours.
I'm used to it. I get it. It is what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, you're convinced when you watch Ron Paul that until Hitler invaded Washington, D.C., he would not have committed one resource into fighting World War II.
Alex, do you want to weigh in on this?
I think the Tea Party is actually having a tough time, managing whether they want somebody who's electable and whether electability is their most important focus for a candidate or a true conservative. The Tea Party wants to beat Obama. That's their number one objective. They want to beat Barack Obama. They know that at the same time they're pragmatic people. They may have an ideology, but they are pragmatic in the sense that they want a candidate who can appeal to the moderate and the more independent voters. So I think with the Tea Party, they haven't been able to commit to somebody that can do both things at once, can energize the base. I don't think there is really a candidate that can energize the base and come back to the moderate segment of the population and win that vote. So at the end of the day, and Ron Paul again, he is great with the economic issues for the Tea Party, but when he moves all the way to the left on a lot of the anti-war issues and the foreign policy, it does turn off a lot of these Tea Party voters who could be, moderate to right on foreign policy, and some of them are social conservatives who do care about these everyday social issues.
Any questions? Yes.
My name's Emily. I'm a sophomore here. I am interested in the concern that because the Tea Party and the Occupy movements are both so extreme, that if the election does focus around those groups, there's an opportunity for the more moderate, center of the spectrum voters to get lost and to become completely disenchanted with the voting process in general. And then I guess the second further part of that is there the possibility for information overload, where there's too much technology in your face all the time and you shut it off and you're done?
Larry, I would assume as the owner and purveyor of a technology company, your answer to the second half of that question would be no, absolutely not. But can you start with the first half? You talked a little bit earlier about sort of the cross pressure these two movements put on the centers of their parties. What about the centrist voters?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm going to say yes to both of those. I agree that both of those are problems. I mean, on the fringe politics, I think the major concern that I have is I think it's really damaging to the country. I think it's really hurting the country. We certainly can see how it's hurting the state of California. And so I think the question in my mind is, will people actually wake up to that, and you'll end up with some coalition that's sort of center right, center and center left, trying to galvanize to try to do something that's more pragmatic and really focus on the good of the country. We don't usually see that in the presidentials, and so we're unlikely to see that now. But will a strange outcome or that takes place because everything is and so fringe during the election, maybe after this next election, something like that would gain even more strength. There's definitely movements in that direction. those of you listening to Left, Right, and Center, Matt Miller and his Radical Center or whatever it's called. So, but no traction yet. No serious traction. On the technology side, I think it's a real. I mean, I'm sick of it. I get way too much stuff. Email, all of your tweets. I mean, now I have to sign up for your Twitter.
I just tweeted about you.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, good grief. Now I'm going to get hate mail. Anyway, but I think that's a real issue. Technologists are trying to figure out a way to solve that. I mean, it's a problem if you're on Facebook. It's a problem if you're on Twitter. It's a problem if you're on LinkedIn. I mean, you're overwhelmed with content.
You can now go on the web, and there are companies that now their service they provide is how to shield you. We're going to work with you to make sure you can't be caught up in the. You have to go like Schnurr here and be off of everything.
Yeah. If AOL could do it all again, it wouldn't be you've got the mail. It'd be you don't have mail. It'd be like yes.
Exactly.
This is awesome. But seriously, it's like if you're on LinkedIn, you're sitting there and you're looking at your timeline. You start there's so much content coming in, it becomes useless to you. So how do you get that organized? So I think some very interesting, innovative people will come along and help people to organize that content. I think ultimately it's going to come back down to this question of who do you trust? Who do you want to hear from? Who are you going to join together to kind of have a dialogue, a reasonable dialogue about what you're trying to do around your political action, your civic being. And hopefully that will emerge as a force in politics. So it won't just all be, more of the screaming media. But that's not going to take place this election.
So, John, to play off of that, the earlier question, how come there isn't a squish moderate version of the Flash Report, where people like me, who sit in the center and don't take the kind of bold, courageous stands that you and your friends on the far left do?
Part of the challenge that you have is that I have found that in general, there's a direct tie between ideology and temperament. Most people who are moderate about their beliefs also happen to generally be more moderate about their temperament. And so it's people that are fired up and passionate that tend to go out and become activists. And so the predominant amount of activism that you see out there comes from people that are fired up, and that tends to have a more ideological skew to it. The reason there's a Flash Report today is because this fired up right-wing alumni of Young Americans for Freedom said, you know what, there's not a voice. I started not to attack Democrats. My website started as the conscience of the Republican Party because I was sick and tired of seeing Republicans get elected to office who were Republicans in name only. And then over time, it's kind of evolved now, and I spend a lot of time now actually beating up on Democrats. But that's the short answer is moderation in the pursuit of liberty is no virtue.
So there really is
my
no
friend
such
Barry Goldwater.
So there really is no such thing as a raging moderate. There was another question.
There are a few actually, but they're few and they're far between. You would be one, actually. Dan is not moderate in temperament, I guarantee you.
There was another question in the back here.
Okay, so you guys have addressed a couple of times the idea of the average American or the average Tea Partier or the average occupier. And I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and I said the average American, and they stopped me very intelligently, and they said, I don't think there is an average American. So my question to you, and this is really just the whole panel, is I'd like some of you to speak about the diversity within both movements and how that diversity is maybe not rationalizing, as Alex proposed, within the environmental aspects of the diversity of the movement, but could be a good thing. It could maybe have been a platform where people could have, found common ground and created different groups.
Rich, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. I was looking at this very long, complex chart that sort of explained all the demographic and ideological differences between the Occupy movement and the Tea Party. And they had, I don't remember who the source was, did a poll of people, a sampling of people in both who affiliate with the Tea Party movement and affiliate with the Occupy movement. And they were breaking it down in terms of political party affiliation, race, ethnicity, age, and all that. And on both ends of the spectrum, the pie chart that was used to sort of analyze the two movements was very colorful and broken up in different ways, right? I don't think it's fair to say that both movements are ideologically homogenous. speaking from my own personal experience, some friends and I from USC College Democrats at one point last semester went to one of the Occupy LA protests, and we were there, and there were people there from all ends of the political spectrum and all sorts of different demographics. I mean, there were, as John talked about, the sort of stereotypical image of the Occupy protester, which is this, smelly, lazy, unemployed, probably stoned hippie, right? And there, let's be fair, there were certainly people there that fit that description. But I don't think that was probably a small fraction of the people that were there. I mean, I talked briefly with a woman who was 24 years old who graduated with a PhD in microbiology from the other university in Los Angeles and was unemployed. So, I mean, there are people that are wealthier, they're very educated, they're, middle class Americans who are concerned about their jobs, there are unemployed people, there are older people, there are people of all different ethnicities and races and socioeconomic backgrounds within the Occupy movement. And I would say that, realistically speaking, that probably applies to the Tea Party as well. I don't think it's fair to say that they are homogenous and uniform groups. I think that it's more accurate to say that they are a group of people that are collectively angry about something. And as I alluded to earlier, the only meaningful difference between them is who they're angry at.
Alex, is the Tea Party a homogenous group?
For the most part, I think that the conservative base of the Tea Party, went out, they are more white, they are more affluent, but I don't think that has really anything to do with what their message is. I think their message is just an ideological idea, their ideological stance on issues that really comes down to fiscal conservatism. And, Republican Party, you have a lot of Hispanics, you have a lot of Cubans, you have a lot of people who, African Americans, who support these fiscal conservative ideas. And fiscal conservatism also stems back to moderate Democrats, like Bill Clinton. And I think that a lot of people in the center might be able to be sympathetic to the Tea Party and what they believe at the end of the day. I think both groups have a reason to be angry. I think that there is a lot of sympathy out there for the failures of government and the failures of what happened after the crash. And the question is, how are we going to go about this? How are we going to fix the problem? And it comes down to, I think, just the fractions within both parties that have to appeal to voters for this election. And it is a populist message. When it comes down to diversity, I don't want to frame either side as, I don't want to put a picture of what the group symbolizes. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think that that's just dangerous for this country. But generally, ideologically, I think that we can, I think that's what we have to focus on. At the end of the day, it comes down to the issues, and all this reality show kind of debating, and all this reality show kind of media coverage of these issues, of these movements, really hurts the future of our country and the presidential election coming up.
I was on a panel where on the panel was a leader of the Occupy movement out of New York and a leader of the Tea Party movement out of Tennessee. And it was interesting because by about halfway through, they both realized they hated Wall Street. And most of the discussion centered around the fact that the Tea Party movement is just as angry at the Wall Street occupation of the Republican Party as the Occupy movement is upset about the occupation. Everybody opposed TARP. Everybody opposed the bailout of Detroit, except maybe Occupy Detroit. And so it was just kind of fascinating to see that there are some areas of agreement.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I don't know about you guys, but I would be happy to keep this conversation going much longer. We're not able to, unfortunately. So join me in thanking Fritz Populist and the College Democrats and the College Republicans and the Daily Trojan and my co-moderator Rachel Bracker for their participation and help on this. To our friends at the Bedrosian Institute and at the Center for Communications Leadership. And finally, to Raz, to Kirsten, to Chui, and to the student workers at the Unruh Institute for putting this all together for us. Next week we'll be back. Yeah, you can clap for them. Next we'll be back in the forum. The discussion will be Republicans and the media. John, and you are coming back for that? Is that
I will be back again.
So if you didn't get enough,
My buddy Andrew Brightman, I have him on a panel so that I look moderate.
If you didn't get enough Fleischman this week, there you go. That's next Wednesday, food at 11:30, conversation at noon. A couple of other things a little bit further up in the distance is a documentary on the election in Ghana hosted by the School of Cinematic Arts on Wednesday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. in the Ray Stark Theater. And on the 23rd, showings of Sarah Palin documentaries, The Undefeated and You Betcha, also in the School of Cinematic Arts, and that's Thursday, February 23rd as well. Thanks very much for coming. Hopefully we'll see you next week.
And a message to our moderate friend. Pick one of these two teams, join up, and moderate them. Because then you aren't being moderate in temperament.
Thank you guys very much.